right. My name is Kristen Hartsaw from the DuPage Federation on Human Services Reform, and today is our first session on navigating public benefits with immigrants in the state of Illinois. Some of you have attended my trainings before. Welcome back. If you are new, let me just take a quick moment to introduce you to the DuPage Federation. So even though we have DuPage in our name, we do find ourselves doing a lot of work throughout the region, throughout Chicagoland and the Collier counties, but even statewide. We are a nonprofit organization. We are not affiliated with any governmental institution. We are a private nonprofit group. My role there is as Director of Training and Technical Assistance. I do a lot of these kinds of presentations on all sorts of things. I would say my area of expertise is really with the state of Illinois benefits like Medicaid and SNAP and so forth, but we also find ourselves doing work when it comes to navigating Social Security benefits, in particular those disability applications, and anything new that comes down the way. So that's a lot about my kind of current role. We also have a language access resource center, and some of you may be familiar with that. Some of you may have even gone through our interpreter training, but we do conduct training for bilingual individuals. We first assess their proficiency in both their own language and the target language, and then they can conduct training, and we are doing that training virtually now. And then once they complete training, they are able to either work with us as a contracted interpreter, or maybe they find positions elsewhere. We also provide those language access services. So we do conduct oral interpretation. We also have written translation services. And we've adapted as best we can, right, in this virtual environment. We do a lot of work with schools, healthcare settings, and even various nonprofit organizations. And then the Federation is also known for a lot of behind the scenes community planning, and we have a council of community leaders that really looks to identify issues, and what we're hoping to do is generate cross-sector solutions. And we really rely heavily on our professional relationships with many of your organizations and others. And we're really trying to help families and individuals access the services that they need. That's kind of how our public benefits training even came to be. I do want to acknowledge the many folks who helped make this possible. So this particular training is offered at no cost, thanks to a grant from the Illinois Department of Human Services, their immigrant integration program, kind of out of their Office of Immigrant Refugee Services and Welcoming Centers. We have a really strong partnership that has been built up over the years with ICER, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. So I just want to express my appreciation to them and their ability to help us sometimes answer questions and connect to many of you and your organizations. And then also the Protecting Immigrant Families Illinois Coalition. So I serve on their steering committee, but there are a number of important immigrant serving and advocate organizations present at that table. And I'm going to forget some of them, but our partners at Shriver Center, Legal Council on Health Justice, Latino Policy Forum, ICER, and many more. And so we all kind of sometimes are crowdsourcing answers to these complicated questions. So I just wanted to kind of give them some acknowledgement. A couple of housekeeping announcements before we really get into the content. I am recording today's presentation, and so you will all receive a copy of the handouts, the PDF of this PowerPoint presentation, as well as links to a YouTube video recording of the PowerPoint. So you will be able to refer back to that. We will post it on our website. We are a large group, as I mentioned, so I do ask that you use the chat box to submit questions for now, and please keep yourselves on mute. I think we're all used to that at this point, but we sometimes need to double check. I was guilty of having two computers open the other day, and one of them was not muted, and so background noise, and that was fun as the presenter, right? Okay, anyway, our agenda for today. So this is Session 1, we are going to really review the core immigrant eligibility rules. I'm going to do just a little bit deeper dive into some of those Illinois rules for who can access benefits. So that'll be slightly different if you've attended this before, not too much, just showing you a little bit more about where you can find that information. I am going to go ahead and talk about public charge as well, because we know there's been a lot of news around that lately. So I will do my best to give you the current status, and then we are going to go ahead and still review the final rule. So I realize some of you may have already had that information elsewhere, but if you are like me, the more times we hear it, sometimes the better. I'm also going to talk about the overall application process and the Manage My Case client customer portal. And I know that some of you on this training are very familiar and do applications all of the time. Hopefully I'll be able to just call out, I'm sorry, I'm just reading the chats real quick. Hopefully I'll be able to call out some of the special things to consider when working with immigrant populations. And I know that the ID proofing process for Manage My Case can be very, very challenging. I do see that someone mentioned in the chat they're requesting a translator, and I am sorry, but at this point we do not have a translator for today's training. So I do apologize if that was not clear at registration. So that's just not a capacity we have for today's session. We can certainly explore that for future sessions. And then hopefully we will have time to not only review some of the resources that we have here for you kind of within the presentation, but perhaps at the end you'll be able to share some resources, whether it's from your own agency or whether it is other agencies that you are familiar with. So we've got a lot on our agenda. We are scheduled for 2.5 hours, so until 4:30. I'm not sure if we will need all of that time for this session, but it's always better to budget for longer and end early if we can. So I will pause periodically to check the questions in the chat box, and we will get started. And I have started to include this disclaimer. So I was making some final edits to the presentation even this morning, but the information is current as of February 2021. And please know that even though we are going to get into some of the rules around eligibility, that the content really in this presentation is meant for informational purposes only. This is not the equivalent of immigration advice or guidance. I am not an attorney. I am not a DOJ accredited rep, so I am not authorized to give immigration advice. Some of you in this training may be DOJ accredited and therefore can give advice to immigrants who are going through the immigration process at whatever stage, whether it's someone applying for DACA, whether it is someone who is seeking a green card, whether it is someone going through the naturalization process. Today's session is really meant to give you an overview of public benefits eligibility and processes in the state of Illinois with a focus on the immigrant population. So to get started, it can be helpful to think about the state agencies in Illinois and who is really responsible for managing the public benefits. And the two main agencies in our state are the Illinois Department of Human Services and the Illinois Department of Healthcare and Family Services. So when you go to a local office or a client of yours goes to the local public aid office, that's really the Department of Human Services, also known as DHS or IDHS for short. This is the office where you have caseworkers who process the applications for Medicaid, SNAP, and cash assistance. They are the ones who are responsible for communicating with the clients. They are sending the notices in the mail. They are making the eligibility determinations. I mentioned the Department of Healthcare and Family Services, or HFS for short, because this is the agency responsible for Medicaid in Illinois. This is the agency that writes the policy for Medicaid. This is the agency that contracts with medical providers and pays the medical providers. This is the agency that contracts with the Medicaid managed care organizations in Illinois. And so if you attend in 2 weeks, when we talk about Medicaid, you'll hear a little bit more about some of those specific programs and rules. There are other agencies responsible for different types of assistance. Even Illinois Department of Public Health, they have some limited coverage with the Illinois Breast and Cervical Cancer Program. And there may be other agencies as well, but these are the main 2 state agencies that touch these public benefits. And public benefits in general, right? That's a term that means a lot of different things to different people. And so this is just kind of an example of the various things that might be considered public benefits. And we could get into a debate if we were like in person in a classroom and kind of talking about, which benefits we earn through a work history versus those that might be considered entitlements, or the old term that I personally do not like, welfare, right? But what kind of assistance do government agencies provide? And so it's all of these things. And I think what was really difficult for me when I first started doing this work was realizing there are all of these different types of assistance programs out there, and all of them have different eligibility rules. And you may be working with someone, or you may be working with a family, and they are applying for 4 or 5 different programs. And each of those programs have different rules around income counting and around who is considered a household member. So it is confusing and it is complex. And so we just want to acknowledge that. When we work with individuals or families, it's important to think about it in terms of, well, does this person meet a category that then opens up a pathway to a certain benefit? That's known as categorical eligibility. And so sometimes age will determine access to a particular program. And what's really funny with these programs is, the definition of a child by age, or the definition of a senior citizen or an elderly aged person, is different by program. So for the aged population, the senior citizen population, with the food stamp SNAP program, you're considered aged at age 60. For healthcare, you're considered age at age 65. So it's different by program. If someone has a disability that prevents them from working, that can open up a pathway to certain benefits, including some of the cash assistance, whether it's from Social Security or other sources. Other categorical eligibility could be veterans. So people who have served in the US military and they have since been discharged, that could open up a pathway to certain benefits. So all of those things are known as categorical eligibility. Each program has its own income, and sometimes there's asset or resource limits. When we start talking about SNAP next week, we'll get into some of those income counting rules. We'll also get into that greatly when it comes to Medicaid in 2 weeks. And then
aquí en el celular no aparece el traductor simultáneo.
Please
mute yourself. A ver si por allí sale.
Please.
No sé por qué no me sale aquí.
Okay. I'm trying to look and see who that is that hasn't muted themselves. So.
No.
Hopefully that helped. Okay, sorry about that. And then there may be other qualifiers as well. And so today's presentation really is getting into those qualifiers of immigration status. But please know, sometimes relationship to the other people in the home matters. To get a benefit in Illinois, you must be an Illinois resident. And so we will talk a little bit about that in terms of immigration status and residency as well. So let's transition into immigrant eligibility rules. And again, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box. I will check for questions at the end of this section. It is a pretty lengthy section, so just be prepared for that. So I might not answer your question right at the moment, but we will come back to it. And if you ask me a question that I do not know the answer to, I will look up the answer, or I will ask another expert, and I will follow up with you after the training. So I think before we get into the eligibility rules for these different programs, it can be helpful to just remember that immigrants enter the United States in a number of different ways. And sometimes that entry status will impact their ability to access a benefit. So some people enter through resettlement as a refugee, or they present at the US border and they want to claim asylum, and so they file an application for asylum. Some people come here for work purposes, and so maybe they enter on a work visa. Many immigrants enter through family sponsorship, and so they have a direct family member, whether that is a parent, it could be an adult child here, it could be a spouse who is sponsoring their entry into the United States. There are others who apply through what's known the diversity visa process, which is almost like a lottery system, right? Where USCIS, or the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, it's like a lottery in terms of whose application gets pulled. And there are many other types. And this is not a training meant to get into these different entry statuses, but I think it's important to understand that how a person enters the United States and what their status is, that is what will impact their ability to access public benefits later. And when it comes to public benefits, a lot of the rules around this are as a result of the Welfare Reform Act that passed back in 1996. And so those of you who help with applications, you know there's a question on the application, like, have they been here since on or before a date in 1996? And a lot of that is due to some of these rules. And we do occasionally get questions from some of you, from some providers who, it is someone who's been residing here since before 96, and they have a very old green card, or they have some other documentation that we may not be as familiar with these days. And so sometimes we need to get some extra assistance to answer those questions, because there are some grandfathered in rules from prior to that date. But today's presentation is really talking about the current rules. And so what it did was change the access to public benefits for immigrants, and it created this term qualified immigrant. They actually use the term qualified alien, but President Biden actually in one of his first orders kind of has instructed to remove that language. So it's a new day. So I've used qualified non-citizen or qualified immigrant for a long time, but it comes from this legislation. And it really applies to the federal means tested benefits. So things like Medicaid, the TANF Cash Assistance Program, the SNAP Food Assistance Program, and SSI, which is also a cash assistance program, but through Social Security. But one of the other challenging things with doing this work is there's always an exception. In fact, if I've learned anything when it comes to immigrant eligibility, there are a series of exceptions that people may fall into. And that's just what contributes to the complex nature of this work. And here are just some exceptions, right? So I was talking about some of those federally means tested benefits, and means tested means they look at income eligibility, and really all of these do, right? But these are many programs on this slide that do not have an immigration status requirement. And so immigrants can receive WIC if they meet the categorical eligibility of being a pregnant woman or a child under age 5. They could get some food assistance there regardless of immigration status. The school lunch program is another perfect example, and that includes that new pandemic EBT or PEBT, which we will talk about next week. And I'll need your help in getting the word out to families. So we'll talk much more about that next week. But then you can see there are many other assistance programs, no immigration status requirement. So let's talk about some of those means tested benefits. I'll give you kind of the big picture, and then we will look a little more closely at the Illinois rules. I will say it now and I will say it again. I do not expect you to remember all of this. In fact, the state of Illinois benefits application will ask the questions, and based on the answers that we enter into that application, it will yield the eligibility determination for that family member. So we are going to get into specifics, but you're not expected to remember all of it. So in general, what is a qualified immigrant, right? What is that qualified status to access these benefits? So for most people who enter under family sponsorship especially, they need to be a lawful permanent resident, meaning they have a green card and they have resided in the United States for 5 years or longer. They may enter, they may receive a green card right away. You know, especially if they applied overseas and went through consular processing, they could arrive with their green card, right? They could be very low income upon arrival, but as a new permanent resident, they must reside here for 5 years or longer before applying and receiving public benefits. If they've been here for 2 years, they have no income, they try to apply for SNAP, they will be denied. However, there are a number of other immigration statuses, usually related to humanitarian reasons, that do allow non-citizens to access public benefits without the 5-year wait. And we're going to get into some of those statuses, but the most common that you may see would be a refugee or an asylee, but there are many more. That means an unqualified or a non-qualified immigrant includes any status that doesn't convey that eligibility for those benefits. And again, remember, we're talking about most Medicaid programs, not all, but most for adults. We are talking about SNAP and we are talking about cash assistance. And so if someone is undocumented, they are not eligible for those benefits. If they are a green card holder who has not yet been here for 5 years, they are not eligible. And if they have a temporary status, maybe they're here as a visitor, they're technically not a resident of the United States. And so then therefore they would be non-qualified in terms of public benefits. So 2 quick examples, and we've got a few more examples later. The first is Josie. She came to the US in 2005. She's had her green card since then, so she's now been here over 15 years. If Josie loses her job and needs assistance, or maybe she's working a low income job, she is able to apply for benefits. She has a qualified status. She has her green card already. With Warren, Warren is someone who came to the US in 2018. He also has his green card, but 2018, that's what? Or where are we at? 3 years? That's 3 years ago. Warren is technically unqualified and ineligible to apply for public benefits. He will have to wait until he's been here for 5 years. When it comes to the state of Illinois policy, I'm going to show you some screenshots and I'm going to give you some explanation straight from the IDHS, or the Department of Human Services Policy Manual. Those of you who've been on their website before or who have gotten into the policy manual, you know it can be very challenging sometimes to find the exact policy that you might be looking for. But I'm all about trying to give you the tools, so if you want to, you can look things up. But please know there are many advocates, including myself, who we are probably in this policy manual on a daily basis. And so if you're having a hard time finding a reference for some reason, please feel free to send an email and ask. You can either email me directly, or you can post the question on Help Hub, which I'll talk about later, or you may have other connections as well from other agencies who can assist. But this is just a screenshot of the chapter 3 of the policy manual. And the first subchapter within chapter 3 actually deals with citizen and USCIS status and when someone meets it. So this is the reference. This is a link that will take you right to this page. But when you get into this chapter, you see on the right side of the screen here, right? So citizen USCIS status, and then meeting citizen INS status for all programs except SNAP. So that's your cash and medical program. And then meeting the citizen INS status for SNAP, and then some other sub-chapters as well. So this other non-citizens chapter with medical, we'll talk about pregnant women. But this is just an overall snapshot of where to find the policies. So let's talk about that. What's a qualified immigrant in Illinois for some of these programs? So first we're going to talk about SNAP. And again, I'm trying to give you the links whenever possible, but to get SNAP in Illinois, you're either a citizen, and that means you're a citizen by birth, or you went through the naturalization process. Also, certain American Indians who were born in Canada may have a protected status. In the policy manual, they have put together refugee, asylee, Cuban Haitian entrants, Amerasians, and other equivalent statuses. And so within that policy manual, you would click on each of these to explore further what's the exact documentation that's needed. Because, for example, it's not just any Cuban immigrant. They have to have a very specific INS status that shows that they're a designated Cuban entrant. You can see some others, including the non-citizens who have lived in the US for 5 years or longer, such as lawful permanent residents, as well as certain conditional entrants and abused spouses as well. The abused spouses or children, or even the parent of child of abused persons, that is really related to some of the immigration relief under the Violence Against Women Act. So the other thing to keep in mind with SNAP, remember earlier I said there's always exceptions, right? And so while for the most part, lawful permanent residents need to have resided here for 5 years or longer, there are some exceptions when it comes to SNAP eligibility. So if they haven't been here because of the 5 years, but they are an LPR who meets any of these other qualifiers, such as they're a child, or they're disabled, or they're a US veteran, or they're an LPR who already has 40 work credits, they may be able to apply for SNAP. So again, it's not so much that you need to know all of this. What I think is more important is to know where to find the information, especially if you are working with someone with an immigration status that you might not be sure of. And if you want the specifics in terms of the types of INS statuses, I would be referring you to the manual as well. And I'll show you a screenshot a little bit later of what exactly kinds of INS statuses they're looking for. With medical and cash assistance in Illinois, here's a very similar list. In fact, it's almost identical to the SNAP list. It's just kind of, they've listed them a little differently in the manual. So very, very similar to the others with SNAP. A couple things about lawful permanent residence and medical or cash. This is one of those points in the DHS policy manual where they talk about that 1996 date. So if it's a green card holder who was residing in the US before or on August 21st of 1996 and they currently have a green card, they are eligible. For anyone who entered after 1996, they have to have a 5-year wait. So I think what happened back in 1996 was a lot of people were grandfathered in or granted that eligibility. Also, this third bullet point, kind of wordy, kind of very policy oriented. It's lifted right from the manual if you can't tell. Essentially what this is saying is if someone entered under another status that didn't have the 5-year wait, like a refugee, like upon arrival to the United States, if someone has been resettled here as a refugee, they don't have a 5-year wait for benefits. They can access Medicaid and SNAP immediately. What this is saying is if they then later adjust to a green card holder or LPR, so let's say they're here, they've been here, it takes them 2 years and they get their green card after 2 years, they don't have a 5-year wait now on benefits. They always retain that entry status of refugee and will always be able to access or apply for public benefits if they meet all the other eligibility requirements like income and other things. I want to take a moment though and talk a little bit about all kids because I think that is important. Many people are familiar with the fact that all kids does not require an immigration status for children to access Medicaid. Now this is an Illinois thing to cover all children, including undocumented children. And there are at least, I forgot the final count. I want to say there's at least 22 or 26 states in the United States that do this, but don't quote me on that number. Anyway, we in Illinois, we do not require an immigration status. So that means children who have no status and have no immigration documents can get all kids. It means if they had status, but now those documents are no longer valid, they've expired, they've overstayed, whatever the situation may be, they can qualify for all kids as long as their family meets income and residency. And then also children who have DACA status, so that deferred action for childhood arrival status as well. They also may qualify for all kids. Now, if you have a child that you're working with who does have a green card and does have an LPR status, it is important that that gets entered into the application because it's behind the scenes in terms of what pot of money in the budget is paying for undocumented children versus documented children. It's different. We can get federal matching dollars for certain documented children. So we want to be able to access those federal matching dollars to pay for the Medicaid program. Otherwise, if it's an undocumented child on all kids, it's the state of Illinois only funding that is covering them. And then in the policy manual, I don't think we focus on this very much, but I know it comes up. There are 4 visa classes that are technically considered non-immigrants. And what that means is they are visitors. They are not, by very definition of having this type of visa, the person is not a resident of the United States, and therefore they don't meet the residency requirements in Illinois. Most often what you probably would see would be people who have a B visa. So that temporary visa, like a visitor visa, whether that's for business or for pleasure, tourism, that kind of thing. But there's a couple of others listed here as well, a C, a D, and a transit without visa. So by definition of just having an active and valid B visa, the person is not an Illinois resident. Now, if they do indeed enter that way, and then they, end up staying and they rent an apartment and they enroll the children in school and now they need assistance, they could make a claim that they are now Illinois residents. But we would caution strongly and refer them to an immigration attorney or other representative authorized to give immigration advice. because there could be potential consequences down the road if they decide to adjust their status. So if they want to go from a B visa to, another status, there could be immigration consequences if they had claimed Illinois residency and started to receive benefits. But it's case by case, so I can't really make a blanket statement. And there are probably other people who are better equipped to answer that question, because this really starts to cross over from public benefits into immigration process. So just kind of an FYI around that. And this is just one example. So when I mentioned that I would show you kind of what INS status is the state looking for, this is just from the one part of the chapter manual. So refugee, asylee, Cuban, Haitian, Amerasian, and equivalent status. So when we are filling out the online ABE application, we will take whatever entry papers or green card or whatever document we have from the person, and we will help them enter that into the ABE application. And it's through that the state will do their data match with USCIS and make sure that the person meets these different INS statuses. So you can see it's very specific, and this honestly gets out of my realm of knowledge, right? I don't know what section 207 is. I don't know what section 243H is as well, but these are the specific type of things that the state will be looking at to verify that they have an eligible status to access public benefits. This is probably way more than you need to know, right? But I like to give you this information because then it helps you, hopefully helps you fill out the application more completely and really emphasizes that importance of having the documentation to be able to answer questions during application and even help follow up if needed. So let's see. So I'm going to just pause quickly to see what questions have come in. It looks like most have been introductions until the last couple, so let's just take a quick moment. So Sarah asks a great question. So state data match with USCIS doesn't work with U visa applicants because their documents are not accessible through the same system. And so how can caseworkers realize this and approve your U visa clients? So Sarah, I think, are you mentioning, are they still in process of application or have they already received the U visa? I will be, so in process. Okay, great. So I do have a couple of slides coming up about the VTTC program. So I will come back to that question, sorry, but I will come back to that question and answer it. And then Rodrigo asked, at what age is a child that had WIC, will they be eligible for SNAP? So depending on their status, if they have an LPR status already, they can have both WIC and SNAP. So it just really depends on what that immigration status is. They can have both WIC and SNAP at the same time. And we'll talk more about SNAP next week. And so hopefully that will help explain further. But that's a good question. I think sometimes we forget people can have access to more than one benefit at the same time. Another resource on the Department of Human Services website is this chart. Now, some of you may be familiar, the DuPage Federation, we've created a very similar chart that is actually hyperlinked then to policy. So it looks very similar, and we have that available on our website. But sometimes, especially if you have to advocate with a caseworker, sometimes it can be helpful to use their own documents. And so this is available on their website and just kind of runs down the various citizenship or non-citizen statuses and which state program they may be eligible for. So just one more reference for you. I think the other thing that can be confusing when working with families is the fact that we have mixed statuses. And so you may have 6 people in the home And you may have 6 different immigration statuses, right? It could happen. Well, maybe not 6 different ones, but they could have multiple statuses. The takeaway is that public benefits applications can be submitted for anyone who has an eligible status. Need to include the other household members just as members of the home so the state can do an accurate eligibility determination. But those people who don't have a qualified status will not receive benefits. So let's look at an example. So in this case, we have Paulo, Daniela, and they live with their 2 sons here. And you're working with them. And so in reviewing everything, they need some assistance. They want to apply for benefits. You realize through working with them, you've got Daniela, who is a green card holder, but just since 2018. You've got Paulo and Eduardo, who are undocumented. They don't have a status. And then you have Fernando, the other sibling, who's a citizen. So if we assume they meet the income requirements, you know, it comes down to who can apply for the benefits, who can apply for SNAP and Medicaid. And this is a great example of where it gets fun. So normally we would break into groups and talk about this, but just in the interest of time and because we do have so many people, I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide. But hopefully, as you're thinking of it, you kind of think about what we just went through in terms of who can get benefits. So the easiest to figure out is Fernando, right? As a US citizen, citizens may apply for any public benefit that they're income eligible for. Daniela does have a lawful status. She's a lawful permanent resident. She has her green card, but she hasn't met that 5-year bar. So she's not able to apply for benefits today. Now, if Daniela becomes pregnant, many people are familiar with the fact that she could apply for Moms and Babies Medicaid during her pregnancy and up for the postpartum period. She could also apply for WIC during her pregnancy as well. So, but as the example reads today, she is not pregnant, so she is not eligible for benefits. Now, Paulo and Eduardo are undocumented. So the difference between the 2 of them, though, is that Eduardo as a child can access All Kids in Illinois. And so he could get some Medicaid coverage. Paulo today is not eligible to apply for any public benefits. So we might refer him to a community health center for healthcare. We might refer the family to food pantries if they need assistance with food beyond what Fernando could get. But if this family applies, let's say this family applies for SNAP, right, for Fernando, because he's the only one currently who's eligible for SNAP. The state, and this is a bit of a simplification, too simple of a way of explaining it, but they would look at Fernando's application and look at them as a household of 4 to then determine eligibility and SNAP benefits for 1 person out of the household. So in this case, we need to include Daniela and Paulo's income to determine whether or not Fernando can get the SNAP. And I'll say it now and I'll say it again during public charge. Fernando is eligible for those benefits. He may get them and his use of benefits will not impact his other family members' immigration status down the road. But we'll talk more about that when I get to the public charge section. And in reality, and I'll talk in more detail about how income is looked at for both SNAP and Medicaid in the next 2 weeks. But in reality, with the SNAP program, they actually will look at all the household expenses and everything and kind of prorate that among 4 people to determine Fernando's eligibility. But the most simple way to think about it is when you're looking at income, you would look at a household of 4, but understand that only 1 person in this family is going to be able to get SNAP. Okay, so here we go. So for Sarah's question, so a newer program, a newer law became effective back in 2018, and it is for certain non-citizens who are in the process of applying for either asylum or a U visa or a T visa. And I'll talk about what the difference is between a U and a T visa in just a moment. The reality is that when an immigrant is filing these applications, it's a pretty lengthy process, even first of all, to prepare the application, but then once they submit an application for a U visa or T visa or asylum, it can take months. It can take months for the immigration officials to kind of get to it and start processing it. I haven't checked recently what the wait is. So just know that we do have immigrants. I think I've even heard of cases going almost 2 years and just kind of still in process. And so what the state of Illinois did was pass that law that while this population is in the process of filing for these forms of immigration relief, that they could access public benefits. Now they still have to meet the program's eligibility rules in terms of income and household relationships and stuff. But as long as they have, and this is from policy, as long as they intend to file or have filed or even have received these visas or asylum, they can access cash, food, and medical assistance through the state of Illinois. So I'll come back to kind of the problem solving to Sarah's question in just a moment, but a quick review, what are these different visas? So I think most people are familiar with asylum, and people can claim asylum. It's very similar to refugees in that someone is being persecuted or harmed, whether it's because of religious or ethnic reasons. Maybe they fled their country because of war or famine. And the difference between refugees and asylees is that asylees present at the border or they're already in country and then make an application, request asylum and request that protection. U visas are for certain crime victims. The definition is technically substantial physical or mental abuse because of criminal activity, and that can be anything from assault to more, domestic violence, and much more. Whereas T visas are set aside for survivors of human trafficking. And each of these visas have caps on it. So nationwide, I believe U visas, they only will give out 10,000 per year. And T visas, I believe it's 5,000 a year. And that's nationwide. So we're not talking a high volume. And in addition, some of the things that are required from the immigrant seeking these visas is they have to be willing to assist in the investigation or the prosecution of the crime in order to be able to get this visa. So you can imagine that can take a long time. There's paperwork needed from law enforcement agencies. We're talking about people who have been dealing with trauma and maybe in the process of recovering from trauma. We may be working with individuals who are very concerned and worried about other family members, especially trafficking survivors. You know, there might be that fear of harm to other family members if they cooperate with law enforcement. So this isn't just an easy process for the immigrant to go through. But for those who are, they're usually working with an attorney or another agency that's, qualified to assist with this whole process. And just because of the length of time and everything and many other factors, obviously this is if someone has fled a situation, they may be very, very vulnerable and they may be in need of assistance like cash or food. And so that's really a lot of the reasons why this law is such a good thing. Now, the challenge is that when someone applies for the cash, food, or medical, and they are in process, like Sarah's question, the reality is they don't have an immigration status today. And so what the state set up for these applications in particular is that when we submit an application, what we're supposed to do is then email the special units, and the email address is here, and let them know that we just submitted a VTTC application. We can also try to put that in the comments section, but I will tell you, we have received several questions recently about applications getting stuck, and we're not quite sure what's going on. And so I can tell you that Carrie Chapman from Legal Counsel on Health Justice actually has just recently reached out to someone at IDHS Policy to try to look into it. And so she gave them some very specific examples to look at. I think what happens sometimes is that, if it goes to a local office, let's say it goes to the Will County or the DuPage County or another office, especially maybe in central or southern Illinois that doesn't see a lot of these cases, what happens is the caseworker may process the application before special units does. And in that case, what we can do is we can try to email this address and say, hey, this is what happened. So I don't know, Sarah, if that helps answer your question or not. I think the challenge is that caseworkers aren't always trained on the policy themselves. So that is a challenge, but I don't know. Does that help if you can just chat real quick? Yeah, it's a good start. Okay, I wish it was easier. There's something with their IES system. They're essentially having to override the eligibility for the citizenship reasons, because if they're in process and have just filed or preparing to file the U visa, they have no active status sometimes. So yeah, so just to kind of recap, so for this population, once we submit an application, to then go ahead and email this email address, put VTTC and then whatever office in the subject line, and then they should just need the application number to be able to pull it. And it's challenging because some of you may have developed relationships with your local offices, and so you want your local office to kind of help follow up, but this is the process currently. And if something changes, we'll be sure to try to get the word out. I will say our friends at Heartland Alliance put out a great fact sheet about this program, but it might not have made the rounds to everyone it needed to. So I will try to include that in my follow-up email to all of you. Rodrigo also asked a question just while I'm looking at questions. So if the person is trying to apply for SNAP and Medicaid, but is studying in a different state, can they apply for benefits? So it sounds like you have someone whose residency is technically state of Illinois, but they go to college in Kentucky. So I will try to make a note to talk about college students next week with SNAP. Because I always have to remind myself of what the policy is, but there's some specific rules around college students and SNAP, and they can't always get it. With medical, I mean, technically, if her residency is here in Illinois, but just going to school in Kentucky, she could apply for Medicaid, but if she needs medical care, she would need to come back to Illinois. Illinois Medicaid will pay for emergencies, but not for regular care in Kentucky. So I can definitely circle back to that in the next two trainings. So thank you for asking. Let me just make sure. I think that is it for now. Okay. All right, so let's see what we learned. I'm going to do a couple polls. So I've got 3 just general scenarios. We're just going to talk about whether or not the person has a qualified status for applying for benefits or not. So it looks like this may come all at once. So I've got 3 scenarios, 3 questions. I'll maybe give you a minute to 2 minutes. The first one is we've got Han, who's 30. He's a refugee. He entered in 2017, got his green card in 2018. Is Han a qualified non-citizen for benefits or not? Do you not know? Is it a maybe? Luke is our second one. Luke is 19. Came to the US in 2006, was granted DACA status, deferred action, in 2013, and he is current on his DACA. He's kept it renewed. And then we have Leah, and Leah is a physician who is here on an H-1B worker visa. She has been here since 2013. So I'll give you maybe another, we'll see, 30 seconds or so. We'll see how the polling goes. So I've only got 36% of you voting. I know you might need a little more time to think about it, especially if you are new to this information. So I'm going to give you, let's say, another 30 seconds to vote. All right, I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I know we had some last minute. Let me share the results. So we've got, some pretty even splits here, and that's okay. This is why I kind of put this into the training. So let's talk about each of them. So Han is a refugee. Remember, he has entered with a humanitarian status. He's been resettled here. He is considered a qualified immigrant for public benefits purposes. And even though he applies a year later and gets his green card a year later, he is still eligible without a 5-year wait because of that refugee status. And so when we enter Han's information on the ABE application, it's really important to enter that his USCIS number or his A number. And then that is one of the ways that the state verifies, whether or not he has that status. Now, Luke is considered, let's see, he is DACA, and I didn't talk too much about DACA. So for those of you who do not know, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, this was the result of an executive order during the Obama administration, and it was specifically for immigrants who came here as children. So, their parents, their family members brought them here as children, and they have no documented status. So for all intents and purposes, they are undocumented. What applying for DACA does is it defers deportation proceedings and it allows them to legally work in the United States. But the person has to meet a series of criteria, like they have had to have come here before a certain age. They had to be present on a day in, was it 2012 when the President Obama signed it? They have to be in good standing, no criminal background. They have to be either pursuing their education and so forth. We have lawyers, teachers, professors, scientists who are DACA individuals. So it allows them to remain here and work lawfully. But it is not, as of today, a pathway to citizenship, though maybe that will change, right, with some of the proposed legislation. But as of today, for all intents and purposes, they are undocumented for public benefits, and therefore he is not a qualified immigrant. Now, while he was under age 19, maybe he got Medicaid in Illinois, but remember, he is now age 19. And let me just double check because I've seen a couple things come in through the chat. So bear with me as I navigate. Great, just to comment. So that's helpful. Yeah, Luke's case was difficult just because I didn't define DACA for all of you and didn't really explain that as of today, there is no pathway to accessing public benefits. The only exception would be if, like I said, he was under 19 and able to get all kids. And then Leah. So Leah's been here, right, since 2013. So let me just scroll and show the poll a little bit. So we've got pretty almost even split here again too. So technically Leah is not qualified because as it reads, she has the worker visa, but she is not a permanent resident. And I actually encountered someone very early on in my work with the ACA and Medicaid applications who this was her exact situation. She had resided here for a long time, but technically wasn't a permanent resident. She just always had relied on her work visa. And so even though she may have been here since 2013, because she is not a permanent resident and does not have another qualified status, she is not able to apply for benefits, even if she ends up losing work and is unable to, make her ends meet. So I hope that helps just explain a little bit more about kind of the whole difference between qualified and non-qualified. All right. Before I go on, are there any other questions kind of about the whole qualified or non-qualified that I've run through so far? And I also realize not everyone may be attending the next 2 weeks, but if you are, the information will continue to build on this. And so I think as we go through examples by program and some of the considerations, I think it will become more clear, especially with Medicaid, because Medicaid seems to have the most exceptions to the immigration rules. All right. Let me talk just briefly about sponsor liability. So when someone immigrates to the United States, unless they're resettled as a refugee or something like that, they usually have a sponsor, and that can be a family member or it can be an employer. My comments today are primarily going to be based towards the family-based immigration side of things. And what happens as part of that process is that family member is accepting financial responsibility for the immigrant. And so there's some rules around like the sponsor and how much income they must have to be able to be a sponsor. You do have some sponsors who do sponsor multiple family members. But as part of all of this process, there's usually an affidavit of support that's signed by that sponsor who's saying, yes, I will be financially responsible. Now, why am I talking about this today? Well, when it comes to public benefits, there may be an impact. And what it is the state of Illinois has policies regarding SNAP and cash. So there's no sponsor consideration for Medicaid. I just want to be clear about that. But depending on where the immigrant is in their residence here as a new immigrant in the United States, if they apply for public benefits, there may be times that they also have to provide their sponsor income. Now, that is something you and I will never know. So sponsor liability is the overall term for when an immigrant still needs to include the sponsor's income with their application or as part of the application and eligibility process. You and I helping families, we will never know that. This is something that is done by the DHS caseworker as part of the benefits application. So what I like to do is just prepare people, and we have heard of some instances where someone's applied for benefits and all of a sudden they're asking for sponsors income and people are confused. Why is that? Well, if you have been here for 5 years or longer, but you still haven't earned your 40 work credits and you have not gone through the naturalization process, your sponsor is still technically financially responsible for you. And so you might be now a qualified non-citizen, right? You've been an LPR for 5 years or longer, but especially with single individuals, they may not have been credited with 40 qualifying work credits yet. And so when they go to apply for SNAP, which is our example on the next page, the state caseworker may actually request the sponsor's income. And then they have a formula where they count a portion of that sponsor's income towards the applicant's SNAP application. They used to ask the question on the ABE application. Those of you who've been around a while may remember that as soon as you would mark, no, the person is not a citizen, it would ask if they had a sponsor. And that question's no longer there. So it truly is something that happens on the back end when the state caseworker is checking. And honestly, I don't know how frequently this comes up. But I thought it was worth mentioning, because if you see a letter like that, or your client comes to you with a letter like that and is completely confused, right? Do I have to provide my sponsor's income, or The worst case is when the sponsor says, no, I'm not giving you that. Just know that it could impact their ability to apply for those benefits. So, okay, just kind of checking. I'll come back to that in a moment. Sorry, trying to manage chat and everything. Okay, so this is a good place to double check. So if there's any questions, I don't have much more to say about sponsor liability. Like I said, we won't really know. They don't ask it on the application anymore. And so it's just really responding to the notice that the person may get. So Angelica asked a question that I don't know that I am the best person to answer, honestly. So I think we have, I saw a couple names. I saw at least one who I think is a DOJ accredited rep. So I may ask for some assistance here. Someone enters as a refugee but missed their court appointment. Does that person still qualify? So I guess it would depend on, well, what was that court appointment for? Once entered as a refugee, they are always considered a refugee, so they should be able to still qualify. So I think I would just need a little bit more information to be able to adequately answer that question. So maybe we'll come back to it, or maybe we can take it offline too. So I will revisit that a little later. All right, let's shift gears though and talk a bit about public charge. And some of you may have heard this information over and over, so please bear with me, but I think it is important to revisit it because we still get so many questions about public charge, and justifiably so. So the concern is, but wait, right? Like, if I apply for benefits, am I going to be able to get my green card later? How is that going to work? And there is no easy answer to public charge, right? So those of you who've been doing this work and helping educate others, it's complicated. And this rule that was revised and published and that we've been living with for almost a year now, it's complicated. And I think it was complex by design. So public charge has been around for a long time, and it was a way for immigration officials to really determine whether or not an immigrant who is seeking entry to the United States would end up being dependent on the US government for support. And if yes, well, they might be denied entry to the United States. It's been part of immigration law for over 100 years, right? It's been around a long time. What happened was during the Trump administration, they went through the official executive rulemaking process and revised and changed the rule and made it a little different. A little different might not be the best way to describe it. So before I kind of get into, though, what the current rule is, let's just recap. Let's just review what I just went through. For the most part, to get public benefits, those immigrants aren't subject to public charge because for the most part, they're either protected in a humanitarian immigration status or they've already got their green card, right? So if you already have your green card, there's just one exception in which you might be subject to public charge, and that's when you leave the country and come back after a certain time frame. And I'll talk about that. So if someone's already getting public benefits and they're an LPR for over 5 years, most likely they're not subject to public charge, right? You have to have that qualified immigration status. And so many immigrant families who are fearful about public charge have been really concerned around the benefits use. And I hope by the end of this section of my presentation, you realize it's not the use of benefits that's the most critical or the most damaging part of the newer public charge rule. It's more so that they're looking at the totality of circumstances and other factors besides benefits use. So this is just my recap. Remember who's eligible for benefits in the first place. And for the most part, it's not people who are subject to public charge. Yes, there might be some exceptions, but for the most part, no. And so that's why it can be helpful to just remember, okay, when does public charge come up, right? When will an immigrant have to worry about public charge? So This is part again of the immigration process, and so it'll be an issue when they are applying to first enter the US. So they're seeking a visa, or maybe they're going through consular processing to get a green card overseas and then to come. Or it applies when they're here already and they're adjusting their status and becoming an LPR, getting their green card. Or that one exception I talked about, someone who is a current green card holder leaves the United States for more than 6 consecutive months. When they seek to come back, they could be subject to public charge at that time. And so, for immigrants who may have a home here and a home abroad, or maybe immigrants who go and stay with family for part of the year, and certainly now that we're in a remote world, right? We're working virtually. You can work. I could work for the Federation from Brazil if I wanted to. um, there might be all sorts of tax implications to that, but I could do that, right? And so I think the caution is, if you are a green card holder and you are going to be out of the United States for more than 180 days, consult with someone, because upon reentry, then you may be subject to public charge again. But otherwise, for the most part, current green card holders, if they're not leaving for that long, there is no more public charge. If they renew their green card, they're not subject to public charge at renewal. If they seek to go through the naturalization process and become a citizen, there's no public charge assessment done at that time. So it's really just critical we understand when it applies. And as I mentioned, there's a series of immigration statuses that are protected and not subject to public charge. And this is something that actually Congress had spelled out years ago. And so it was not changed by the Trump administration's executive rulemaking process. And so these are just some examples. So refugees and asylees, not subject to public charge. VAWA, that's Violence Against Women Act, those folks who are seeking immigration relief under that rule, not subject to public charge. The UT visa folks, certain special immigrant juveniles, many, many more, protected and not subject to public charge. So right away, knowing when it applies and knowing that it doesn't apply to everyone, those are some general key messages. And I've already said this, I left it in here though, so you can refer back to it. Doesn't affect people who went through naturalization and are now citizens. And LPRs not subject at renewal or naturalization. Green card holders or LPRs only subject when they leave for 6 months or longer. So what's the current status, right? Wow, what a journey this rule has been on. From the time that it first was proposed and so many people, over 200,000 comments submitted opposing the rule, from the time that the final rule was published in October of 2019 to when it became effective last February 24th. And it remains in effect today. There's been many, many court challenges, many court rulings, including one here in Illinois that we've actually had some favorable wins with regards to the case. So that's really exciting news. But the short answer is litigation continues. And while it continues, there are currently court orders in place saying that USCIS is allowed to use this final rule. Many of you may have heard that last week, President Biden signed 3 immigration-related executive orders, one of which instructed the federal agencies to review the public charge rule and kind of see, the impact on services. So Health and Human Services had to review it, and certainly Homeland Security and others. This is a very positive first step, but I just want to let you know that it has done nothing to change the rule. And in fact, it would be very difficult for an executive order to undo this rule because it went through the official rulemaking process. It got published in the Federal Register, was open for comment, all of that. What could happen is the agency itself, DHS, could potentially propose a new rule around it. There might be some other strategies as well. The other reality is litigation continues, and we're hopeful because we've had some important wins. And so maybe it's just better to let that process play out. And there's a lot of legal implications and processes that I am not equipped to really talk about. So the short answer is this rule remains in effect for now. And so anyone who is applying for a green card on or after February 24th, if they submit a green card application today, they will be subject to this rule. And so that's why I've kept it in the presentation. But we remain hopeful and the fight continues. So, you know, we may have to be patient a little bit longer and continue to advocate. But in the meantime, let's educate our communities so they are clear on what this is really saying. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on it just because I know so many of you have attended presentations, whether mine or my partners at other PIF Illinois agencies. But let's go ahead and kind of review it. So the concern was that it dramatically changed the definition of who might be a public charge and added to the list of benefits that are subject to public charge. But I really want you to take away the impact of totality of circumstances. And I'll define all of this for you. So the old definition is on the left, right? Immigrants who might become dependent on the government for support might be denied public charge. And in the past, they looked at whether or not someone had an affidavit of support. And if yes, that was usually enough to overcome public charge. So if they had a sponsor, had an affidavit of support, that was usually enough. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this definition because it's confusing. You know, what does this mean? 12 months in the aggregate for a 36-month period. You know, we don't need to focus on that so much. Basically, what they're trying to do is figure out if someone's going to need public benefits in the future, and if yes, for how long. And if it meets this definition, then they might be a public charge. So the benefits previously, old definition looked at cash assistance like TANF, SSI, looked at Medicaid for long-term care only. Now what they've done is they've added the use of SNAP and Medicaid, but with some important exceptions. And keep in mind, it's not so much current use of benefits, but whether or not someone is ever going to need these benefits, whether now or in the future. So you might be working with a 30-year-old today, but when they turn 70, are they going to need public benefits like this? The reality is with our American healthcare system, many people who need nursing home care are going to end up at Medicaid at some point just because of how expensive nursing homes are. So, you know, all of us could be needing benefits at some point in the future. And I'll come back to that thought in a little bit. But yeah, let's take a look. So some of these benefits people are then concerned about whether or not if they use them, would they be subject to public charge, whether now or in the future. I think it's important to note very specific exclusions for Medicaid, meaning these Medicaid programs do not count, will not be subject to public charge. So if someone has had Medicaid and they were a child, actually through age 21, there is no, that use of Medicaid does not count against them on a public charge assessment. Same thing, the Medicaid for pregnant women or emergency Medicaid for non-citizens, and then some others as well with the disabilities community. So some of the services based in schools or provided because of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So anyone who's used Medicaid for these reasons, not subject to public charge. And it's only those benefits listed. And remember, it's not retroactive, meaning if someone submitted their green card application in, let's say, December of 2019, and USCIS is just getting around to processing that green card application, they should be assessed for public charge under the old rule because they got in their green card application before February 24th, 2020. So that's just another important point. And it's only use of benefits by the immigrant applicant themselves, right? So when we were talking earlier about mixed status households, whoever's eligible for public benefits may use those public benefits. And if the parent, you know, didn't have an eligible status, but later is adjusting status, The rule says use of the child's benefit will not affect that immigrant parent's application. But what you're going to hear in a moment is it's that totality of circumstances that we need to be concerned about. So I'll come back to that too. In fact, here we go, leading into it. So remember, what this rule is trying to do is tell the USCIS immigration official how to predict whether or not this green card applicant may need public benefits in the future. And if they're gonna need them for this time frame. So the real question is they are making a prediction based on a number of different factors. And that's what the totality of circumstances is. How they are making a prediction is by looking at the green card application and looking at the person's age, how many people are in their family, are they working or not, do they speak English or not, all of these different things. And so as I go through the next few slides, I think what we need to do as advocates is think about, especially if we have someone who wants to apply for a green card during this time frame, keeping in mind, litigation continues. Maybe there'll be a change in our favor in the future. But if someone really is wanting to submit that green card application now, understanding, okay, these are the totality of circumstances, how can our organizations help families gain the skills, gain the job opportunities, gain whatever they need to have a successful outcome when it comes to this totality of circumstances. So age, a lot of these things relate to a person's ability to work. And so if someone who's applying for a green card is under age 18 or over 61, that might be a negative factor in their totality of circumstances, because immigration's saying, or Homeland Security is saying, well, it's less likely they'll be able to work and be self-sufficient, I guess. Education skills, they're going to look, does the person have an education? Do they have a higher degree? Are they in a specialty field that is in demand in the United States? Do they have specific licenses? Can they speak, write, read English? Now they're looking at English literacy as part of this. So that might be an opportunity. Maybe we connect and make sure that our immigrants that we're working with, gets connected to English language classes. Maybe we get them into job training and certification programs or something like that. Health, here's an option. So first age, and you could consider that age discrimination. Now we've got discrimination based on health conditions or disabilities. So now they're looking at whether or not that green card applicant has a medical condition, if it's a high cost to treat medical condition, or if it's a disability that prevents them from working. And if that's the case, then that might be a negative factor. We know that larger households will be looked at more negatively in terms of family status. And so what's also unclear is whether, if let's say I have a strong case in my age and my education, maybe I have a higher degree, maybe I'm 30, but my health condition is poor. We're not clear if one negative factor will outweigh a positive. It's just not clear. We haven't seen enough green card applications come through under the new rule to know how immigration officials are looking at these. Income and financial status is another concern. So lower incomes, that will be a heavily weighted negative factor. Here is an opportunity though, if the family or the individual who's applying has income at or above 250% FPL, that is a positive factor. It amuses me that they have credit history here, because if you are a new immigrant to the United States, you may not have much of a credit history yet. So they are looking at all of these kinds of things. So again, how can we help people overcome this? And this is what I meant earlier, it's not the child's use of benefits that will be a negative factor for the parent who may be applying for a green card. But if the family's income is so low that they are able to get certain benefits, that could be the issue, that it's the low income, the income that qualifies them for benefits in the first place. It's the income that will be the negative factor. So that is a concern. How do we report this, or how do immigrants report this? It's through a new form, which is really more than a form, right? Those of you who maybe have seen this, it's more of a booklet. The form itself is 18 pages long, and it collects all of this documentation. It also asks questions about whether people have applied and or received public benefits. And the form went into use last February and is still in use today. I can tell you that PIF Illinois, we have a small work group working with Department of Human Services, and we've really helped them understand the impact of this form and what green card applicants may be coming to them to ask in terms of proof of benefits or proof of no benefits. And so it's been a good partnership to try to help prepare DHS offices for that. So they're in the process of kind of finalizing a few things. So more to come there. But the reality is, you are still getting lots of questions, I'm sure, about this. And so these are just some key messages to remember that everyone's situation is different. It doesn't apply to all immigrants. And if there are really questions about, should I apply for benefits? What if I'm going to adjust my status? Technically, we want them to connect with either an immigration attorney or an accredited representative who can answer those questions. Okay. Oops. And where can you go for more information if you're not already connected to Protecting Immigrant Families Illinois? We do have a website now with a lot of different information. In fact, there's a new fact sheet there, especially with regards to COVID-19 and immigrant eligibility for emergency Medicaid and how COVID is an emergency condition. So there's a fact sheet that was put together around that, some other things as well. You can sign up for the listserv through PIF Illinois at povertylaw.org. It's the best way to get the most up-to-date information. There's also a national protectingimmigrantfamilies.org, and you can sign up for their emails as well. And so we were on high alert when we knew that President Biden would be signing those executive orders and waiting to see what was said. There's a couple other links here as well. So immigrationlawhelp.org is just one avenue to try to find immigration attorneys or DOJ accredited reps in your area. We also have a listing on the Protecting Immigrant Families Illinois page. And then our partners at ICER as well, they have a couple of different resources for you. They also have a directory of legal assistance, but they also have their funded partners through the Illinois Immigrant Family Resource Program, IFRP. Some of you who may work within that program actually, right? But you all have received some training around this and can help point people to needed resources. They also have a hotline staffed in multiple languages. So those are all some good resources for you. So, all right. And I know some people are saying they have to leave early, and that's quite all right. Remember, this is being recorded, so we'll have access to those recordings later. All right, so it is 3:30. We are scheduled for another hour. Again, I don't know that we will go the full hour. I think we're doing all right. It'll kind of depend on how your questions come for this next section. But I'm going to transition to the overall ABE application and talk a little bit about Manage My Case, and then we'll wrap up. So for those of you who are very experienced in ABE, feel free to chime in if you have any extra tips or if you've run into issues, especially with applications for immigrant clients. But ABE is the online application, and I can't stress enough how important it is to apply online. But before I get to that, as part of the application process overall, the state workers are required to verify immigration status for those immigrants who are requesting benefits for themselves. And so we talked about, some of the issues that we might see with VTTC applicants who don't have a status yet. And I mentioned, all kids and so forth. But whenever possible, it's really critical to enter in their documentation and their A number, because that is what will allow the state worker to run their match with the SAVE system, which is what they use to just verify eligible immigration status. I will also just tell you that it's very clear in state policy. You know, if you think about those mixed status families who are applying for benefits, you know, like Daniela and Paulo, I said, you have to put all 4 people on the application for that one child. But if there was an eligible child who had an immigration status, they should only be running the check on the child or the person who is requesting benefits. They should not be running a SAVE check on anyone who is not requesting benefits. If you want that policy reference, let me know, and I am happy to send that over your way. I can find that link for you. But back to the overall application process. So again, we're talking application for state benefits right now, and I cannot stress it's important to try to apply online. I know some people still prefer paper applications, but especially even now with all these caseworkers working remotely, you know, who's checking the fax machine in the office? How often are they checking the fax machine and processing the mail? And then who's entering those paper applications into the system so a caseworker can process it? It was already a problem with paper applications getting lost before COVID. And now these offices are sometimes only having 5 people in the office at a time. I mean, it just depends on the office. So the best thing to do is to apply online because you always have a record. You can also apply on phone, but I haven't heard lately. Last I knew, it was pretty long hold times on that phone line. This is the ABE website. Many of you are probably helping people create their own accounts and apply for benefits under their own accounts. There are some community partners, especially All Kids application agents or MPE, Medicaid presumptive eligibility partners, who might log in with their own login and then do an application. But for the most part, many community-based organizations are helping the client create their own account. When it comes to ABE, there's 2 parts to it. Let me go back a slide. There's the application, and then once they have benefits, there's their client portal, or what the state calls their ABE customer portal, and it's known as Manage My Case. So I'm going to talk about the application part first, and then we'll talk about Manage My Case. There's some requirements. So to create an ABE account, they have to come up with a user ID that is unique to them, as well as a password. That password has some enhanced requirements. You know, it has to have the letter, number, special character. Passwords will expire every 6 months, so they will need to change the password. There are some security questions to select and answer in case they forget or they need to change their password. Once granted benefits and once they go through the ID proofing process, they can then link that login information to their case to use Manage My Case. But to do that, they need to go through an identity proofing process, and that's where a lot of people get stuck. And the reason why is it's done through the credit bureau Experian. So I'll talk more about ID proofing and how you can still do it later. I think the takeaway is that you can still use ABE. You can still use the online application to submit an application without going through ID proofing. There's a button within the system to just say verify identity later, and then you can proceed with the online application. So this is just a screenshot of how to create the user account. A couple of things, it's challenging because, you know, I might try K Hartsaw, right, as a user ID, and I might then fill out all of this stuff. And then when I click create account, it's not until then that they tell me, nope, that username's already taken. So that can be frustrating, right? The secret questions, again, are just for password recovery. And so you want to make sure that it's something the client will remember. And I will say they're not the most user-friendly. especially even for immigrant clients. Sometimes it's like your elementary school or things like that. The other thing about secret questions is some of them are things like your parents' anniversary date. Well, that's great, except how did you enter it, right? Did you enter it just the month and the day? Did you enter it, I'm using even the American way of listing a date, right? September 20, whereas other countries will start with the day. So 20 September. It's those kind of things that you just need to make sure people will remember how they entered it, so that if they need to use and answer the secret question later, they've got it. So some agencies actually create like a cheat sheet to give to the client and tell them to put it somewhere safe. I already talked about identity proofing. Here it is for you to read over again later after the training when you come back and look at all this material, right? Again, you can verify identity later. You can hit that button and still go on with the online ABE application. Once you kind of get through the creating an account, you'll start a new application. If you don't get all the way through the application, you can always log out, save it for later and come back. And then you would click the second button here when you get back in the system. And you can even log in later to pull up the application that was previously submitted. And that can be really helpful sometimes, because if the state maybe didn't budget something correctly, or maybe you want to know, maybe the client comes back to you and says, hey, my job changed and my hours changed. What did we put as my income on the application? And that could be something you pull up later to look at. There is a section within the ABE application to serve as an approved or authorized representative, an approved rep. This could be a family member. Some agencies, but not all, will have their staff members serve as a client's approved rep too. It's not necessary unless you want to be able to communicate with the state on their behalf and answer questions on their behalf. It will require you to protect their confidentiality and their information. And you will receive notices that the client also receives. This is not something I can tell you should or should not do. This is really an agency by agency decision. And if you have questions or wonder if you should, I can certainly put you in touch with some agencies that do act as an approved rep. I'm not going to show you a screenshot of every screen in ABE, I promise. I am going to show you several here at the outset, but then we'll move on, I promise. But I think some of the things that sometimes confuse people, one of the very first screens you'll see is select which program to apply for. And again, you may be only applying for one program, or you may apply for several. You may have some family members, think about those mixed status families where maybe you're applying for the kids for SNAP and healthcare, and maybe mom is pregnant, so you're applying for healthcare too. So these are all things that you would just, whatever benefit you want to apply for, you'll select. And then later, when you enter person by person on the application, you will check an individual box for each person for which benefit specifically they're asking for. And this is just kind of the basic information, right? So you just start entering who's the first person, who's kind of head of household. You'll kind of put that first. More information. This is what I was talking about, where you would select the program. So if you have the parent, you're putting a parent who's undocumented on this application because you're applying for the children, you would not select either of these boxes for that undocumented parent, unless it was mom who's pregnant, right? And then you could for healthcare only. So I think that's important. You don't necessarily select this program selection box for every person on the application. Over here, you see the question right away, if they're a citizen. So I'll come to that next. So as soon as you mark that no, they're not a citizen, these are the additional questions that will show up in the application. So right away, is this a request for emergency medical? And we'll talk about that in 2 weeks. Is the person documented or not? That's a scary question for some family members, right? Especially that undocumented parent. Now, I will say not all of these questions are required. And if it's an undocumented parent, and you leave it blank, as long as they're not requesting benefits, then there should be nothing else that happens, right? The state worker should not request documents from an immigrant parent who is not requesting benefits for themselves. But I'll tell you, lately, I do not know what's going on. And we have not figured out if it's one office. It seems like it's multiple offices. But we are seeing these kinds of requests where you have a parent who's applying for their child only. And the next thing you know, they've gotten mail that says you need to provide your information. And that's incorrect. So if you see that, definitely post it on Help Hub. You can contact me to talk about it. I think we've already sent a couple of examples to DHS policy about it. They always say they need specific examples, and we can certainly talk about how to protect the client's identity and everything and be confidential about it. So, anyway, I kind of digressed a bit. So if they are documented, though, these are some of the different documentation types that we want to include and enter, and especially that alien or USCIS registration number, that is really important to enter. If you don't have it today, you can still proceed with the application, right? You only have to fill out the sections that have the red star or asterisk next to it. Not all of these questions are required, but it does add time, because what will happen is the state worker will need to request the documentation to be able to make an accurate eligibility decision. So it's best to go ahead and include that as part of the application. One of the questions we get a lot, and we'll get into this in greater detail next week, but like, who really needs to go on the application? Who in the home needs to be listed? And it really depends on what program are they applying for, because there's different rules for SNAP and cash than Medicaid. So when in doubt, list everyone. And then depending on how these questions are answered, the relationship, and then for Medicaid tax filing status, that will really get at whose income counts for each applicant's eligibility. But, we can just kind of let this lie. You can refer back to this later. We will revisit this in great detail as we get into the specific programs next week. Income, just a couple of things to point out about income. And I will say that, at the end of application, when you have the opportunity to attach proofs to the online application, income is probably one of the most important things to include. For many things, the state can do electronic data matching, but income isn't always timely or accurate in their different, like, Department of Labor databases. So really important to include that. And then just be mindful of how you enter, how often they get paid, because if someone gets paid weekly or gets paid bi-monthly, like that means twice a month, like on the 15th and the last day of the month, or if they get paid every 2 weeks, that actually can impact things, because the state often has to work out a monthly average. And it's really important when you have people whose paychecks change, they maybe get paid weekly and every amount is a little bit different each week. To get at a monthly average, the state actually does a formula where they'll add it all up and get that and then multiply it. And it can sometimes put people over the income limits for the program. So we need to just be really careful how we are entering in that income. And then I also wanted to talk about self-employment, because sometimes immigrants, especially immigrants who get paid cash income, it might not you might put it here or you might put it under self-employment. And so it just really depends. What is the type of employment, and are you able to really document their income? Now with self-employment, you know, if someone's maybe, I don't know, a taxi driver or an Uber driver, you know, are they considered self-employed? Do they have business expenses? And those kind of things. The state is supposed to accept the client's statement of what their gross income is and what their expenses are, unless something seems questionable. That's actually how it's phrased in the DHS policy manual. And so there are times where a caseworker will request additional documentation because for whatever reason, the records that were submitted are not clear to them. If someone is, let's say, plowing snow or doing landscaping or doing handyman and they're paid cash income, you know, if they have their own ledger of, you know, keeping track of how often they're paid, if they have a regular person they're working for, is that person willing to write a statement or a letter saying, yes, this person works plowing driveways for me and I pay them X amount of dollars every so often or per job? You know, those kind of things can be used as proof of income as well. In the end, they're supposed to accept, you know, if the client signs and writes and attests to what they're earning and can provide documentation, they're supposed to accept that. We have heard, though, of instances where the caseworker will request more. So I'd be curious to hear if you have ideas or suggestions around that. And then the other sections of the application, you know, what I like about the online application, it only asks the questions that the state worker will need to process that applicant's eligibility. And so, you know, if someone's applying for Medicaid, it will ask about, do they have other forms of health coverage? If someone marks that they're disabled, it will ask, are you getting any of these disability benefits? And so that's what RSDI stands for. That's those Social Security, retirement, disability, or survivor's insurance. SSI is something different, but it is a Social Security disability benefit. It'll ask if someone applies for SNAP, it'll ask about expenses like housing and utilities, things like that, assets. And then a couple other things. So Class X felonies, usually drug felonies, it does ask that question. Please know people can still get healthcare. They can still get Medicaid. Usually those Class X felonies are going to restrict someone from getting cash assistance. So just because someone has a felony doesn't mean they need to not apply. And then victims of domestic violence, that question is asked for a number of different reasons. One, you know, you could use it as part of the whole VTTC thing, right? But also VAWA. And then also there are some special rules that allow people who have left their home because of domestic violence. It allows them to get set up on separate cases. It allows them just some extra protections. So that's just, I thought it would be helpful to mention, why is that question there? And there's many other questions. Like I said, this wasn't going to be an ABE screen by screen training. Signing and submitting, you know, I used to print off the applications for people, but I think as long as they remember their login information, they can always log back in. It is an electronic signature. I usually review these rights and responsibilities. Please make sure they understand the importance of reporting changes, and especially reporting changes timely, especially if receiving things like SNAP. We'll talk more about the impact if they do not report changes next week. And then you'll see once you submit, and this is obviously a very old screenshot, right? For any of my DuPage County people. The DuPage office is now in Naperville. It's no longer in Villa Park. But essentially you will find out what office has the client's application, and this is who they need to follow up with later. Technically, though, they can choose a different office, and that is up to them if they want a different office to process their case. The tracking number is very important. As many of you know, if you need to follow up on an application later, as we mentioned with VTTC applications, to be able to send that to the special units. if we need to ask DHS policy to look into something that we think maybe was an incorrect determination, or if we need to file an appeal, having these tracking numbers is very important. And then after you submit is when you upload the proofs or the verifications, and you select which ones you have and do that. And these are just some examples of what you can submit. Again, proof of income is really critical. Might be proof of immigration status as well, and some other things that we'll talk about in future sessions. All right, let me check in. I saw a couple questions, so let me see if there are application type questions before getting to manage my case. Let's see. Will non-LPRs with children in the All Kids program ever be able to create a Manage My Case account? I just asked that question recently, Rocio. And the short answer is you can try to do manual ID proofing. So I'll try to come back to that in a moment. And can you write the fax number, please? You know what? That is a great question. So are you talking about the fax number for the application to be submitted? It is probably the local office, but you know what? Let me double check if there's a central fax number for applications. Usually people are faxing them to their local office, so each local office has a different fax number. And I can double check and follow up on that one. So good question. And to create an ABE account, does the client need an email address? I don't believe so, no. That's just more of a login account. However, there is a way now in Manage My Case where they can request to get email or even text messaging notices. It's more so not the actual notice, but they'll get a message saying you have a new notice posted in your Manage My Case account and come log in. So let's talk about Manage My Case, right? So this is I call it, it's like internet banking, except it's for your DHS state of Illinois benefits. And so by creating and linking to their case, they'll be able to see what benefits am I getting? You know, when's my next SNAP disbursement? Am I due for renewal or redetermination, right? I can try to notify and send a message to the local office. I've heard mixed results on the email function. I can file even an appeal through Manage My Case. So lots of functionality that makes all of our lives simpler if the person can get linked to their account. And the reason they require this identity proofing process is it's really due to some federal data security rules. So I'll just leave it at that. There's a link here to the ABE customer support page. We also have some older PowerPoints about using Manage My Case, including Manage My Case presentations in multiple languages. So those are posted on the Federation's website because this grant actually helped us do that. And we may need to update that soon, but I think it's a good starting point that you can refer people to. We have them in at least 5 languages that I remember. So this identity proofing process, we really should have everyone try. And so once, you know, they've kind of submitted their application and maybe they've gotten a notice that, yes, you have benefits now, they can come back and try to link to Manage My Case. They will need to answer some questions first electronically. The state wants everyone to try the electronic ID proofing process first. And you'll see in a moment what those questions look like. But if they're not able to do it electronically, there is a way now to send in a form and request that the state manually prove their identity and grant them access to their system. So let's look at some of those questions. They really are based on credit history type of questions, right? So if the idea is only that applicant would know these answers. But if they're a new immigrant or they are undocumented, they don't bank, they don't have a credit history in the United States, they're not going to be able to successfully go through this process. But for those who do and can, that it's a really streamlined process. But this is the message that you'll see if they were unable to verify identity. And so then the next step, and this is what the state wants people to do, is go through each step. The next step is to call the Experian helpline, give them the reference number, and in some cases, they'll be able to complete it via the phone, even though it didn't work online. And if that's the case, the Experian rep will give them a PIN number, and then they can go ahead and proceed. But now, if that did not work, now there'll be a link directly to the manual identity proofing request form. And you'll see in a moment what will happen. A person fills it out. They need to fill it out completely, attach copies of their identity documents, and send it back to Springfield, specifically to the ID proofing unit. We have been hearing HFS, in fact, has been telling us that if individuals fax to the fax number, they're able to process them fairly quickly. They do say if you mail it in, to give them at least 6 to 8 weeks, and then they'll send back a notice telling the person if it was successful or not. They'll mail back a notice. What HFS has told us is that if you fax it in, that you can try logging in sooner and seeing if it works, because in some cases the notices aren't being sent out very timely. And I think part of that is just these challenges of working in a remote virtual work environment. Who's staffing this Springfield office to actually process the mail? Yeah, that's just another separate topic, the delays in the mail. It's becoming a big issue with timeliness with some things with state notices. So anyway. So to request the manual ID proofing process, they must already have an ABE account. And if they have multiple ABE accounts, because some clients do, right? They get locked out of their account, they can't remember, and then they create a new one. They have to pick one. They have to pick one, and they fill out all the information on the form. If they leave something blank, the form, they won't process it. So it'll be kind of rejected or denied or whatever term you want to use. And then they need to attach a copy of one of these documents. So if they have one from column A, they can just do that. If they don't have anything from column A, then they need to do 2 from column B. So back to Rocio's question about, can an undocumented parent request, the child, to get access to manage my case for the child's case? The most recent answer I had from HFS is that they would have to go through this manual ID proofing process, and it would have to be the parent. So then that's a challenge, right? Because what if the parent doesn't have any of this? Then the answer is going to probably be no. But if there is some way you can do something with, I don't know. If they have an Illinois state ID, I don't know if that's possible. I suppose they could try. It's not on the list. Well, there is, look, foreign passport. Don't know if that would be possible, or a consulate ID. That could be something too. And then the parent would be the one then that would be the owner of the ABE account to then look at the child's case. I would be really curious if other people have done this and if they've done so successfully. So it was something I just asked, and that was the answer I was given. I personally haven't seen it in practice, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't happen, right? So that's the thing. So I see a couple questions. I'm hoping, Alicia, you mentioned you're not able to identity proof. It doesn't go any further. So then are you able to do the manual and send in? Because it looks like the next person, Famida, says you've done both and it doesn't work. And some other people are saying the same thing. So if the ID proofing is really not working, I think what the answer will be, if I reach out to DHS, they're going to say, can you give us specific examples? So I think maybe let's have just some correspondence offline and talk about the best strategy to do that. So I'll have to think about that, because I think if I could collect a number of them and give them examples, we just want to be mindful to protect confidentiality. I don't need to necessarily see all of your clients' information, but we definitely want a way to connect. Okay. Oksana, thank you. So Oksana is mentioning that she just never hears back from their patients whether or not it works. So yes, the state is supposed to be sending letters to them, to the client themselves, saying you've been successfully ID proofed or whatever. I don't think it's phrased like that, but we were able to complete that. And then they instruct them to go ahead and go log back into ABE. And so that's what I was mentioning, that they do say to try to log in, even if they don't get that notice, since some of the notices have been delayed. And I hope it goes without saying to please don't send original documents, right? But, I always worry about the person who might be trying to do this on their own and mistakenly sends their original. So it really should be copies of all of these things. So once ID proofing, you get through all the challenges and the barriers. The first thing to do then upon logging back in is to link to their case. And so, that'll be prompted. And the way they do that is either by entering a date of birth and an individual ID number. And if you don't have the individual ID number, then your social security number, which obviously is going to leave out a lot of people, especially parents who are undocumented, trying to get in for their child, right? The individual ID number should be found on notices sent to the family, but I know that can be difficult to locate the individual ID number. Excuse me. So this is definitely not a perfect process, but for those who are able to get this information, this is what it looks like. And so it's got 4 tabs across the top. The case summary is where they're going to see, if they need to report a change, they can do it here. If it's time for redetermination for SNAP, that will be there. The state's not doing Medicaid redeterminations right now, but when that comes back online after the end of the public health emergency, we might have a lot of people having to do this. So when it's time for RED, that'll be there. They can also see, what's going on. They can see the status of their current programs. And then, they can pull up notices, which can be helpful because sometimes people never see their notices. If they need to upload additional documentation, that also will be a function that they can do. When they report changes, these are the different changes that they can report. So they can, say whether or not someone moved in, someone's now pregnant, change of address. If they are needing to submit medical expenses, which we'll talk about more with Medicaid, they can do that through Manage My Case as well. The second tab is benefits details. And so this is where they can pull up, okay, you've got health coverage. Let's look at what you've got. And so what's great is it tells you when their coverage began, if they're on a spend down, which is something we'll touch on briefly during the Medicaid presentation. It'll show that. When their redetermination is due, if they've lost their HFS medical card, they can print that. If they have a managed care plan, they'll see which one that is and when their anniversary date is. So it's really about how to manage and teach the client how to manage their benefits. And I had mentioned same thing down here, the bottom, the SNAP, the SNAP information is here as well. And I didn't include screenshots, but there's contact information. You can log in or click on that tab to see, okay, well, let's see what address the state has in their system. That can be really critical if someone says they're not getting any notices and then you log in and see, oh yeah, well, they have you living in Bellwood and you're now in Forest Park. That's the challenge there. So there's a way to check that and also see which local office has the case. And then account management, that's some other things, communication preferences. I think they can change password. They can add other household members and some other things. So with that, we are doing great. We are about to wrap up. So let me just check quick if there are any other questions about Manage My Case, knowing that we don't always have the information. But I think whenever there's specific examples we can give about, the process not working, that's how they can help hopefully fix it. I will tell you that advocates very much want the ID proofing process to be less cumbersome and wanting the state to figure out a different way to do that. But as of now, this is kind of the process we have to live with. So I just want to conclude the presentation, and then we can open it up to a few questions if you're interested. Otherwise, I know it's a lot of content and it's the end of the day, right? So some resources for all of you. So the state has a whole initiative, and some of you may be funded through some of these programs. So we've got welcoming centers that help new immigrants who are new to the United States. The Immigrant Family Resource Program, which really helps assist with benefits application and navigating the human services system with immigrants. New American Initiative, I think that helps, right, with going towards kind of the whole immigration process and citizenship and all of that. So if you want to see the list of the current agencies in Illinois, this is where you go on the state website. Here's the direct link to that policy manual that I started off the presentation talking about. So just wanted to kind of give you that link. And then the chart, the link to the chart that I did the screenshot for as well. So those are those 3 state resources for you. While I'm wrapping up, if you have other resources to share, please do so in the chat box. Also, this is the listing of the current IFRP agencies. We actually did a lot of training for those folks. And so we've got this listing on the Protecting Immigrant Families Illinois website, but these are folks who can help do some basic education about public charge and public benefits, but also connect people to their legal resources, if they have them, or to other agencies that give legal assistance. And then if you haven't been on our Federation website lately, we do have a lot of different information. Really, I would point you to the resources page. There is a public benefits and a training page, but kind of sometimes our information is in different places. But I think you would find the most information under resources and public benefits. Lots of different tools there that are available to you. If you are not on Help Hub, I always encourage people who help family members with applications or help the community with applications to join Help Hub. It started as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Our partners at Shriver Center are really responsible for maintaining it, but you have experts from many different agencies helping answer. It's like a great way to crowdsource answers to complex questions. And it's when we notice trends as well, like this whole requesting of immigration documents from people who haven't requested benefits. Like, it's a trend right now, so we need to figure that out. Our partners at ICER also have a wealth of information on their webpage. And then, of course, Protecting Immigrant Families Illinois. I know there are more. All of you help immigrants, right? There are many, many more, but these are just some ones that might be a good resource to keep in your tool belt. These are the next 2 sessions we have coming up. So next week, if you haven't registered already, you'll want to do so, and you can find that registration on our website. Next week, we're going to focus on SNAP and PEBT. There's a lot of news around PEBT and how it's rolling out this year. So if you can't make it next week, don't worry. I'll be sending out information. Greater Chicago Food Depository has some information already, some FAQs around it. So we definitely want families to know that it's coming. I'll just tell you in short, there's no application process this year. They have to be enrolled in free and reduced meals at their school. They'll automatically get a card. So if they have to apply for free reduced meals, they got to do that with their school. More to come. We'll also touch on TANF and briefly AABD cash assistance. And then I'll try to give a quick overview of Social Security as well. In all of these, my focus isn't going to be the whole detail about all these programs, but a little bit about core eligibility and what immigrants need to know. And then February 25th is mainly Medicaid, but we'll also talk about the new Medicaid program for immigrant seniors. We'll talk a little bit about the ACA marketplace and some other resources, especially resources for care for undocumented individuals. And let's see, here's me. So if you have questions for me, you are welcome to email me. What I always tell people, and I hate to have to do this, but my inbox is a little out of control. So if you email me a case question and you don't hear back from me in about 2 days, maybe 3, and I don't have an out of office reminder on, feel free to give me a nudge and say, hey, Kristen, did you see that message? So yeah, we will. I hate to do that, but it's just kind of the day and age right now. And yeah, in my follow-up email, I can certainly get you the link for to register for the next training. And so here's what to expect. So after today, what I'm going to do, and actually let me pause the recording now so it can